You are looking live at the interior of my office. So welcome back to How to Read the Bible. This is part four, our final part, and we're blessed once again to have Deacon Riley Durkin join us via voice chat. How you doing, Deacon?
Hello, Langdon and surrounding greater Langdon area,
Potentially my parents too. I don't know. They might be watching this.
and also the Stites family. I let my parents know about it too.
Oh,
So
and Riley's mom
maybe
and dad.
hello to
Yeah,
mom and dad as well.
yeah, yeah. Well, you got to be starting to get a little bit close to finals week, huh?
I'm intentionally not looking at the date of when we can go, but I think because that's not helpful. Um,
Ye-
but I think it's around May 25th ish,
That's
whatever
when
that
you
Friday
can.
is.
That's when you can fly the coop.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's when I will.
Yeah.
I can go home at any time, but I just can't come back, and I just don't think it's worth it. It's not something I
Mm.
want to do.
Mm. Okay. So you would have the option of leaving. Wow.
Yeah,
But then you'd just be staying around at your parents' house.
that or a parish or something.
Yeah.
And I'd rather be here at SPS.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, yeah, for anybody that's listening, I'm on almost day 30 now of quarantine
Hmm.
here
Has
in
any has
St. Paul.
anybody has anybody gotten it?
No, no, we had a scare a couple weeks ago, but the test came back negative.
All
So
right.
thankfully, everybody stayed healthy this month.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because I don't know what we would do if someone got sick.
Yeah. Yeah. Just make him stay in his room, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's a protocol in place, but I think if push came to shove, would, it'd be a it'd be a rough rest of the school year.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
everybody's been good. Nobody's left campus, and everybody's being responsible.
Is your computer trying to talk to me, Riley?
That's my phone. Let me
There you go.
silence it.
Okay. Silence my phone too. Otherwise, I'll just be a hypocrite. Not
On the
everybody
street
out.
corner,
Yeah, that's right. Straining the gnat and swallowing the camel.
beating your
As
breast.
as somebody said. Who was that? Well, anyway, I think we're getting pretty close to this. So, welcome back to How to Read the Bible, Part Four. This is going to be the final part, and if everything goes well, we should actually make it out of the Book of Genesis today. Um,
To be fair, though, Genesis is one of my, aside from the Gospels, one of my favorite books in the Bible.
right, right. No, it's definitely worthwhile to spend the time, but it's just like, okay, teaching us how to read the Bible, and you spend half your time on the first 11 chapters. I don't know. Somebody might think it's silly, but I don't think it's silly.
Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark. Are we talking about Abraham today?
Yes, yes, we are talking about Abraham. Getting to the patriarchal narratives. So anyway, the YouTube chat should be up. So if anybody finds a question gnawing at their heads, they can just go ahead and type it in there. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and get started. Now, there's a big shift when you get to Genesis chapter 12. A big shift from sort of a mythological genre, as we've talked about over and over again, to something that's a little more straightforwardly historical. And so, since we're having a bit of a genre shift here, it's going to be important for us to remember to adjust our lens for viewing the scriptures because you wouldn't want to use the wrong lens. You wouldn't want to be trying to treat this as if it were a primarily mythological text when it's actually much much more historical, both in the way it's written and in its specific content. So, and then just to remember that the conventions of ancient history were a little bit looser. They didn't have room for footnotes on their papyrus scrolls or on their parchment, and so we just got to give them a little bit of room for following the conventions of their day and not expecting kind of modern history book that you would expect from a university professor nowadays. So, let's dive right into it. Our first point of discussion is are these even historical books? Can we treat this as events that actually happened, or are these primarily fictional accounts? And so your ancient and medieval sources, they would say uh, it was history, right? That the patriarchal narratives, that's the narratives about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were primarily historical. You get to the early 20th century, Julius Wellhausen, we've encountered him before. His theory was that Moses didn't even exist, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, these were all idealized accounts from a later time. So we could take a look at the arguments that they have for that. They're saying that this is an idealized account from a later era, usually dated after the exile. They'll say that they can't find any archaeological evidence that a person like Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob would have existed. Um, they point to the fact that they've got these encounters with God and these miracles, and they say that signals that the genre we're using here is a legend. And they point out certain anachronisms. So they say that camels had not been domesticated in the time period described here, that the Philistines would not have been present in Cana at this time, that they immigrated to the coast later. The name Potiphar is historically out of date, and so they say, well, these things are all evidence that these events were written down centuries after they claimed to be and have no historical grounding. And then they look at prophecies. So at the end of the book of Genesis, Jacob is prophesying about his sons, and he says that Judah will be the royal son, not any of his older brothers. Um, so they see that as sort of what retroactively editing history to make the tribe of Judah the legitimate royal heirs. Um, but we don't have to follow these arguments. So, first off, it's not all that unusual to expect that there wouldn't be any archaeological evidence of a specific historical person from uh, 1800 to 1600 years before Christ. Um, Second off, ancient Near Eastern biographies would often mix historical facts with supernatural happenings. And so that was certainly a convention of the genre. And so reading that at the time would not have immediately made you think, oh, that this is just a fictional story. Moreover, supernatural happenings are in fact real, and they can actually happen to people. Miracles, encounters with God, all of these are certainly possible. Um, yeah, I found a lot of arguments over camels.
For
Uh,
some reason, that's something that scholars really double down on, is the
yeah,
domestication of camels in this era.
no camels.
That's something they're really putting all their chips down on.
Hmm. Yeah,
And maybe it's more important than I realize, domestic, but domesticated camels. Um, but for whatever reason, this is things a lot of people will talk about.
yeah, right. Um, so, camels at such a date, like, gosh, I don't know when camels were actually domesticated. That's not going to make me throw out other mountains of biblical evidence in favor of that. And maybe a later author changed Potiphar's name to Potiphar. Um, that doesn't really like destroy the entire historicity of all 50 chapters of Genesis, or the chapters we're talking about. Prophecies are certainly possible and okay if you believe in God. And I think probably um, the most important thing about the idealization is that these are not really idealized accounts at all. And so I'm just going to crack open one of my books here, and they're going to show you what the uh, the patriarchs were like. I'm just going to do a little flippy here. All right. So, Abraham's marriage to a half sister, contrary to the Mosaic law. The law of Moses forbade marrying your stepsister, but Abraham did that. And so, if this was an idealized account, he wouldn't have done that. The prominence of Sodom and Gomorrah, which were destroyed in the mid second millennium BC and played no role in later Israelite history. Jacob, the father of all Israel, duped into marrying a woman and her sister, contrary to the Mosaic law. Uh, Ephraim and Manasseh, the sons of Joseph, and both of them being heads of tribes, being half Egyptian through their mother, the daughter of a pagan priest. Reuben as the firstborn son, despite the fact that his tribe was never prominent. Levi, the forefather of the holy priestly tribe, was a violent killer, cursed by his father. And the traditional enemies of Israel, Ishmael, Edom, the Philistines, and Pharaoh, are portrayed sympathetically in this text. Um, so this is hardly what you'd expect out of an idealized account. We have idealized accounts even in American history. So you could think of something like George Washington and the cherry tree. That wasn't
Hmm.
really like there's no historical grounding that anything like that happened, but we kind of keep on telling the story because it teaches the value of telling the truth, and especially when it's hard. Um, I think there's a lot of whitewashing, especially in the 19th century, a lot of whitewashing of the Pilgrims. They weren't actually fans of religious liberty. When they landed in Massachusetts, they immediately had an established church and instituted a law that this was the established church, and other churches are. Um, I don't know if they were all the way illegal, but they were discouraged and they were kind of limited. They were disenfranchised churches. But
Yeah, I mean, they broke away to have their own from one religion to have their own
right.
religious community.
But if you read
The ones that weren't allowed in England.
a lot of popular histories written in the 19th century, they portray the pilgrims as heroes of religious liberty. Um,
Right. Well, and that's true in the sense that they were breaking free so that they could be free to celebrate their own religion.
right,
But then
and
they
then
also didn't allow anybody else. So there's your
right,
problem.
right. Whereas the real heroes of the freedom of religion was the Maryland colony, which was colonized by Catholics and had the first acts of toleration. So there's a little bit of U.S. history for there. So those are what idealized accounts look like. They're usually very simple and they don't have complex characters. And obviously, we've got these very complex characters who are um, they do all sorts of things that you wouldn't expect from an idealized account. So, what on
Yeah.
earth is idealized here? I don't think there's anything. So, that just seems like a pretty solid argument that these are based in history because if you were making it up, why wouldn't you make these guys perfect?
To say it another way, if this is something that well, the heroes of the story, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, um, Joseph's family,
Mhm.
they're not portrayed like heroes.
Right.
They're not portrayed like protagonists,
Hmm.
which would be unlike any other hero genre or epic genre of the time.
Hmm.
It would be more like maybe a little bit idealized, but more of a
Hmm.
historical narrative.
Right. And this will come up a little bit later, but did you know that no pharaoh ever lost a battle or made a mistake? Because
Yeah,
if you read all the official accounts, they're just perfect at every single thing they do.
yeah, all the Egyptian accounts,
Yeah, all the Egyptian accounts,
ancient
yeah.
Egyptian accounts.
Just perfection all the way through. They're the best. They have no problems. It's great. They're tremendous. We love them.
Well, they
Yeah.
were portrayed as deities.
Yeah, right. And so that wouldn't have shocked anybody if they had done that, but they didn't do that. So that's pretty interesting. And I think we've even got a little bit more evidence for historicity here. Uh, so there's these odd biblical stories, right? Some really odd stuff. Um, So I'll just go through some examples. The adoption of a servant as heir of the household. So if you'll remember, Abraham's complaining that he doesn't have an heir to his household, and that his servant was going to inherit all his property, rather than having a son to do that. And that's when God promised him that he would have a son Isaac. Um, Turns out that there's actually other you know legal codes, other customs, other laws from that era of the exact same thing happening, that you could adopt a servant as your heir of the household. And so that never made a whole lot of sense to me, but yeah, it was just it's explained by that certain tablets recovered in that area. Um, a wife supplying her husband with a surrogate mother in the case of infertility. That happens multiple times across Genesis. Turns out perfectly normal back then, or so people thought. Um, yeah, the sale of an inheritance to a brother in exchange for provisions to avoid starvation. So you remember the story of Jacob and Esau, where Esau is starving, and Jacob's got some stew, and Esau wants it, and Jacob won't give it to him until he gives his inheritance over to him. Um,
Yes, worst
Apparently,
deal ever.
yeah, it's even worse than selling Manhattan for, $900. Apparently, though, that was perfectly legal, and in fact a thing that happened back in the day. Um, so if these stories just seem very odd, come on, Riley. Uh, if they seem very
What?
odd and they don't, it was just something really loud came through your audio.
No, I don't know what's going on.
Um, yeah, a lot of these very odd stories are perfectly normal in, you know, the second millennia BC. Furthermore, when we look at the stories in Genesis, we've got a lot of moving around, we've got a lot of trade. Um, the era between 1800 and 1600 BC, which is when a lot of people suspect would have been the era of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There was a lot of free trade, and free travel, and nomadic clans traveling around with their herds and their tents. Um, and that was a pretty normal way of life at that time. And even by the time you get to 400 BC, things had changed pretty greatly. Um, Egyptian military presence and Canaanite warfare, things were just a lot more intense in that area. And then Egypt, which had formerly been friendly with the Semitic people of the region, and now we're beginning to be much more domineering, much more hostile, much more likely to take, say, slaves from among the Semitic people. Um, so the stories we have in the book of Genesis uh, about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob not only are plausible stories, but they're plausible stories in the time that we would have thought that they would happen. They were plausible stories in history, in a specific time of history. Um, so, yeah, there's plenty of reason to believe that, in fact, the narratives from the second part of the book of Genesis are, generally speaking, grounded in real historical people and real historical events.
Yeah, I think those are good points. The lifestyle matches up, and I don't think any atheistic historical scholars would disagree with that. What
Hmm.
they would say is we shouldn't believe this because there's miracles involved.
Yeah, yeah. Which is, you can't actually prove that no miracle has ever happened.
Well, because you can't prove a negative
Right,
of
right. You'd have
anything.
you'd have to look at every instance of everything ever and prove that they all strictly followed physical laws. And the only person who could do that is also the person who could, cause miracles. Uh,
Right.
Talking about God. right. So, basically, when you're reading anything from Genesis chapter 12 to Genesis chapter 50, stories about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and his brothers, these can certainly be regarded as accounts that are based in history, accounts that are based in real historical figures and describing events that happened. So, I
Um,
think that's pretty great news.
yeah, right. But what's important to remember is not same similar as when we were talking about the mythical genre, not always necessarily word for word. Um,
Right,
right. So
right. Even
there's
the most ancient opinions about the Book of Genesis was that it was written by Moses, and he would have been what, something like 400 years after the time of Abraham.
right.
So it's like, well, like, did he reproduce these conversations exactly? No, probably not. Was he trying to? No, probably not. But these were
Yeah,
certainly traditions that could have been handed down generation to generation.
and even things like the name of Potiphar or what were some other examples you gave here? The
The
camels.
camels, yeah.
Um, so little details like that. I don't want to call them textual errors because they still hold some at least spiritual truths to them
Hmm.
because of scripture. Uh, but don't use every word as this as strictly a history text.
Right, right.
Does
So
that make sense?
we could take the anachronistic name Potiphar. Maybe it was like, well, we don't remember the name of the Egyptian captain who owned Joseph as a slave. What's a good Egyptian name? Potiphar. Okay, we can do that. I mean,
Right.
that shouldn't shatter your faith in God. That kind of a revelation, I wouldn't think.
But it is good to take these portions of the book more historically than Adam and Eve or Noah necessarily.
Right, right. Historically, in the modern sense of history. Yeah, yeah. Certainly, certainly. All right. So, let's talk about something that nobody wants to talk about nowadays, polygamy.
For or against?
Well, it's complicated. So, what's interesting is that nowhere in the Old Testament is polygamy explicitly forbidden, right? There's no law against polygamy in the Old Testament. And so we see many of them, especially the patriarchs, they have multiple wives. So Abraham had both Sarah and Hagar at the same time, and he married Keturah after Sarah's death. Well, that one's not the same, I guess. And then Jacob had four wives at the exact same time, which is, I guess, how you end up with a dozen sons. Um, and there's no explicit reprimand from God for doing this. But what you notice about the book of Genesis is that there's an implicit critique across the entirety of the book of Genesis that every time polygamy is practiced, it doesn't go well for people. So when Abraham has Ishmael, Hagar's son, causes nothing but strife in the family. So early on, uh, Sarai got annoyed with Hagar because she had had a son and she was, starting to kind of get proud about it and kind of arrogant about it, and so she had Abraham drive her off. No, no, Hagar ran away because she was so miserable. And then an angel of God came and said, "No, you gotta stay there and put up with it for a while." Then after Isaac is born, uh, Sarah sees Ishmael the teenage Ishmael kind of messing with Isaac, and so she tells Abraham that Hagar needs to go. And Hagar doesn't want to do this, or Abraham doesn't want to do this, but he relents because God tells him, "Don't worry, I'm going to take care of the two of them. They're going to be a great nation." And then what's funny is after this whole incident with Hagar's son, the requirements for the covenant are elevated when God introduces circumcision. So that didn't become a part of the covenant until after Ishmael was born. When we get to the Jacob story, Jacob obviously plays favorites with his wives and his sons. That his wife Rachel, that was his favorite, and the other three were just kind of, meh. And then Joseph is his favorite, and we get a whole 13 chapters of the Bible out of that context. The whole Joseph story. Um, Comes from the fact that Jacob was favoring one of his wives and one of his sons above all others. Um, then you can go back to Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. It says, therefore, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and the two become one flesh. Well, it's kind of hard to square that passage with the practice of polygamy. And then also Lamech, who was the seventh descendant of Cain in the cursed line, was the first to introduce polygamy. And it seems like by the time of Jesus that the ancient Jews had figured out that polygamy wasn't really the way it should go. It seems because it was not commonly practiced at that time. So it seems that by that time they had learned the implicit lessons of the book of Genesis. So yeah, there's no real trouble with that. It's like, God hadn't given an explicit law against it yet, so they couldn't expect to be following a law that they hadn't been given. But in the new covenant, it's quite clear. So to answer your question against Riley.
Right. And that's an important thing to point out. Even things like, I don't know if you're planning on talking about Leviticus or Deuteronomy at all,
Uh,
but the laws in there um, put restrictions on things that we would say is obvious or obviously wrong now. I won't give any examples, but uh, God was able to put more barriers around to remove this integral part of the culture
mhm,
uh,
mhm.
to the Christian life we live now. Uh, so polygamy, yeah, you can look at it and say this was wrong because God punished it a lot in the Old Testament,
Hmm.
but it
Yeah.
wasn't something that the people were ready to have removed because they were young in their faith.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, they weren't uh, mature. I don't know how to say
They
it
were
exactly.
God had to start small with the laws and build it from there, basically,
Right, right, because it
because
all leads up towards Christianity.
right, right,
Um,
it's all a preparation stage, and it's like, well, you can't build the first floor until you've laid the foundation. You can't lay the foundation until you've dug a hole.
yeah, right, right, right. So we can look. Well, here's a good example about Leviticus. He puts restrictions around slaves,
Mm.
owning slaves.
Hmm.
He never explicitly says don't
Hmm.
uh, in the Old Testament, but he's integrating, humanizing these people.
Right, right, because the slaves, especially Hebrew slaves, actually had rights, that there were things you couldn't do to them.
Yeah, and I think
Whereas
it's tough to talk about in the United States because American slavery was particularly brutal in world
hmm.
history.
Hmm. And then
Um,
tenaciously defended with biblical
yeah,
passages.
right. So yeah, slavery's bad. I want to put
Yeah,
that out there. Of any,
yeah.
um, but Jews, because of the laws, treated their slaves at the time a lot better than any other culture.
Or at least they were supposed to. There was an expectation
Or
too.
right, right. There was
Yeah.
uh, there was more rules about
Hmm. All right. So we're going to take a look at a specific story now. Comes from uh, Genesis chapter 18. It's about Abraham and God having a conversation about the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. So you probably remember this one. Will you really destroy the upright with the guilty? Suppose there are 50 upright people in the city. Will you really destroy it? Will you not spare the place for the sake of the 50 upright in it? Do not think of doing such a thing, to put the upright to death with the guilty, so that the upright and guilty fare alike. Is the whole judge of the whole world not to act justly? And then, most of us are very familiar with this passage. Abraham bargains God down for the sake of the 10. And so, we like hearing that story normally. It's showing that God is indeed quite merciful, um, that he can be bargained with, but kind of gets us into a problem. We've got a passage from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It says that God transcends the world and history. He made the heaven and earth. The heaven and earth will perish, but you endure. They will wear out like a garment, but you are the same, and your years have no end. Uh, in God, there is no variation or shadow due to change. Um, God is he who is from everlasting to everlasting, and as such remains ever faithful to himself and to his promise. So let's focus in on that. In God, there is no variation or shadow due to change, and so this is something that you could start teaching, older children, maybe fifth or sixth grade. Talk about how God exists outside of time, and about how God is always eternal and he doesn't change in time. And so that can make understanding passages like the one we have from Genesis chapter 18 a little hard to comprehend, because it seems like God is changing his mind about whether or not he's going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. But there's actually a really interesting way to think about this is uh, God's will can be thought of in functioning in two different ways. So we can, and I'm going to have to use a some technical language here, so just bear with me in it. You can talk about the conditional will of God, and you can talk about the absolute will of God. So what do I mean by that? Well, the conditional will of God, uh, God can make it so that he will act on the condition of humans doing something with their free will. So I could give you another example. God could say, I will give uh, a certain grace to Deacon Riley if Deacon Eric prays for a decade of the rosary for him, right? And so God is,
Hmm.
as he's willing that, he's saying, I will give this grace if Deacon Eric prays his rosary today. Um, the thing is that if I choose to be lazy, and if I choose not to do what is my habit is to pray the rosary, um, then God wouldn't give that grace. That God he sets himself up with that condition, and so we can distinguish the conditional will of God from the absolute will of God. So you could look at something like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Um, there was no conditions put on that. He didn't place himself under that. He just went and did it. He's like, this is how I'm going to do things, and he doesn't place those kinds of conditions on himself. So when we look at this story here, we see that God, I think God actually probably would have spared the city just for the sake of Abraham's nephew Lot, who was living there. Um, but he was unable to find 10 just men in the city, so he ended up destroying it and pulling Lot out of there. Um, so it's not like God is changing his mind in the way that we would change our minds. Um, he is simply allowing himself to act under certain conditions, and he's the one who's placing those conditions on himself. And all of this is a part of the eternal will of God before all time began.
Right. So to just bring this to a little homily, if you will, about the power of prayer, that's why it's so important to pray for other people, because it really does matter. It
Hmm.
really does. Um, I don't want to say it changes things. Well, in a sense, it does. It
It
changes
changes things in the world.
a situation.
Hmm.
Yeah, and also God would. first preempt it with giving us the grace as of an idea. I should pray for this person, right? And then we choose to do it or not do it.
Right.
It's not it's not like God would say, well, if the only way this person is going to be healed from cancer is if this atheist across the world says a prayer who's never said a prayer in his life for
Mhm.
this person, and I'm not going to give them any inclination that this should happen in any way. And then it doesn't happen naturally, and then
Mhm.
God says, "Well, oh well, no, there's certain God will give a little shove to the thing that needs to happen, and then it's our job to respond to that."
Right, right. It goes back to that passage in St. John's Gospel. It was not you who chose me, but I who chose you. And then
Mhm.
elsewhere it also says, if you remain in the vine, I am the true vine. If you remain in me, you will bear great fruit. And so any kind of genuine prayer, uh, so not just mouthing words, but really getting your mind and your heart involved in it, will always begin with call from God, a call um, to prayer. God will be the first one to invite you to prayer. You don't have to come up with the idea of praying yourself. So same thing
Yeah,
here. God was, while speaking with Abraham, inspiring him to intercede for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, the just people there.
right. But that being said, sometimes that there's nothing we can do. You hear stories about pastors, generally not Catholic. Someone will come to this pastor and say, um, "Oh, I prayed to God that my aunt would be healed from her sickness, and she died." And the pastor will say, "Well, that's because you didn't pray hard enough, or
Oh.
that's because you didn't do X, Y, or Z." No, that's not the case.
Hmm.
Absolutely not.
Hmm.
Um,
Right, right.
death is an evil, and sometimes and it happens,
Yeah.
and sometimes in horrible, terrible ways that there's
Hmm.
nothing we could do about it.
Right. Right. Yeah. Good point. Good point. God wouldn't really let that much ride on your cooperation. It doesn't seem life and death, that kind of thing.
Hmm. Certainly pray for people, but
Right.
if it doesn't feel like your prayer is being answered, know that it, it was the will of God.
Hmm. Hmm. All right. So we're going to move on to a another story that can sometimes get people a little bit hung up. We're going to talk about the binding of Isaac. So you remember the story that um, God ordered Abraham to sacrifice his son, and that's that can be pretty troubling to people, and there's a lot of misconceptions about it. So we can look at this picture I've got here. This is a fairly common depiction. You can see they've got the altar built, and they've got the wood for the fire, and then they've got Isaac lying there and Abraham with his knife. And usually in these pictures, Isaac is depicted as about a 7-year-old, 8-year-old. But really, there's not a whole lot of biblical evidence or traditional evidence that Isaac would have been that age. He was a lot closer to 18 than 8. So the Hebrew word used here is also used in Genesis chapter 2, verse 5. Uh, so Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you." That's how the Revised Standard Version puts it. But in Hebrew, the words for young men and the words for lad that were translated here, um, they're the exact same word. So what the word means in the Hebrew is, well, young man. That could be 18, maybe up to 24, 25 years old. Moreover, so if we want to get a good picture of what that would have looked like, we'll just go ahead and say that. You can see in this picture here, we've got a bit of an older Isaac, but here's the thing. Um, he would have had a lot of wood on his back for a proper burnt offering. So I looked up how cremation works, and in order to get full cremation, You put the body in a crematorium for at least 90 minutes or so, and you heat the oven up to about 1600 to 1900 degrees Fahrenheit. So several times boiling water, and that'll cause complete disintegration. So if you want to imagine the pile of wood that Isaac was carrying, it'll, you know, that's obviously an insufficient pile right there, and I'm not even sure about that pile right there. It might be a little bit more like this scene from Lord of the Rings. Um, like a big pile for a burnt offering. And so you'd need to be a pretty hardy young man there. Um, and at this time, Abraham was 99 years old. So if Isaac did not want to be sacrificed, he would not have been sacrificed, right? He would have been able to overpower the old man and run away pretty easily once he figured out what was going on. Um, so that means that in this story, instead of having a young boy being forced into it, as I think a lot of our imaginations would naturally tend there, we actually have a grown man who is presumably also a believer in God, who presumably also had faith, um, who's following this prophecy. Um, Moreover, we can look back at Genesis chapter 22, verse 5. Um, Abraham says, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you." So I guess a lot of people might assume that Abraham doesn't know what he's talking about, or that he is lying to these young men that Isaac's going to return. But we actually have this very interesting passage from the letter to the Hebrews. That's a New Testament letter. Um, Hebrews chapter 11. It was by faith that Abraham, when put to the test, offered up Isaac. He offered to sacrifice his only son, even though he had yet to receive what had been promised. And what had Abraham been promised? He'd been promised a great nation through Isaac, right? Not Ishmael, explicitly not Ishmael. Through Isaac, he had been promised a great nation. He was confident that God had the power even to raise the dead, and so, figuratively speaking, he was given back Isaac from the dead. And so I think that's really important for understanding this passage, because this is an incredibly important passage of Scripture. This is a very early prophecy of Jesus Christ himself. Jesus Christ, who carried the wood of his execution on his back. Jesus Christ, who, as a grown man, willingly gave himself up as a sacrifice. And as it says here, God himself, Isaac asks, "Where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" And Abraham says, "God will himself provide the lamb for the burnt offering." And then God does fulfill that with the ram they find after Abraham has stopped, but the true fulfillment is in Jesus Christ. And so, if you didn't understand this story here, you might have a distorted vision of who Jesus is. If you were trying to have an 8-year-old Isaac as your foreshadowing of Jesus instead of a 18-year-old Isaac, somebody who's capable of making his own choices, you could get what you believe about Jesus kind of mixed up. So I think it's worthwhile to spend some time here and begin to understand this passage deeply.
Yeah, I mean, this is what we've been talking about for the past few weeks: is the truth behind the words, right? The prefigurements that are happening
Mm-hmm.
when we don't see them right away. And
Right.
there's, I don't know if we have time to get into it now, but you touched on it, is that there's so many parallels you can draw between the binding of Isaac and Jesus' sacrifice on the prescriptions for the Passover lamb.
Mm-hmm.
And even since ancient Christian times, church fathers, church doctors have been drawing these connections, saying
Right,
this is talking
right.
about Jesus,
Yeah, yeah.
and Abraham had no idea.
Right. Yeah,
The
no, he,
Jews had been preaching about Jesus since since this.
yeah, yeah, no, it's right there, right in the beginning. Prophecies about Jesus can be seen. So, so anyway, hopefully that puts some people's minds at ease about Isaac. So, next we're going to get to a pretty interesting part of Scripture. We're going to talk about Jacob, Rebekah, and Esau. Jacob and Esau are Isaac's sons, and Rebekah is his wife. Um, and let's talk about Jacob first off. Genesis chapter 25, he won't feed his famished brother until he trades his birthright. So that's some real brotherly love right there. In Genesis chapter 27, Jacob steals Isaac's blessing from Esau by putting his clothes on, putting Esau's clothes on, tying sheepskin to his arms, right? Because apparently Esau had these big hairy arms. Sheepskin was the closest approximation of it. And then lying to his father and receiving his blessing. And these blessings were a big deal in this culture. The father's blessing to his firstborn son. Um, and so when Esau catches words of it, he's begging his father in tears if there was a blessing left for him. And all of this was done at the instigation of his mother. Um, Rachel highly favors his wife, Jacob highly favors his wife Rachel over his first wife Leah. And this is the person that is the the first in the line, the founder of Israel. His name is later changed to Israel. He's the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Um, what's going on here? And so we can look at this. You can see in the text of the book of Genesis, while God never explicitly punishes him for his lying and his deception, um, there's implicit punishments all over the place. So it's not like Jacob gets off scot-free for what he does. In Genesis chapter 27, shortly after stealing the blessing, Jacob has to run away from his home because he catches word that as soon as Isaac is dead, Esau is going to kill him. So that's great. You got to run away from home and go make it on your own. Genesis chapter 29, Jacob is actually tricked into marrying Leah, not Rachel, by his uncle Laban. Um, it's the same sort of deception that he had pulled on his own old man, and that was used against him. When we get to Genesis chapter 32 and 33, um, Jacob is kind of on the road with his family. They're moving, and he hears that Esau is coming, and he's spending 3 days thinking that Esau has finally come to get his vengeance, that Esau is going to uh, kill him, kill his servants, take his wives and his children as slaves, and then um, when Esau finally shows up, Esau's like, Jacob, hey, man, I haven't seen you in years. What's going on? And Jacob's a little shocked that Esau's not angry at him. And so he spent 3 days stressing out over meeting his brother instead of being able to relax and plan a great big party for the two of them reuniting. And then when we get to Genesis chapter 37 and 50, the entire Joseph cycle, there's a lot of pain and drama in that. Jacob thinks that his favorite son has been killed for most of it. And then he thinks that, then a famine comes and, all the pain and drama that go with that. Um, and all that drama would have been skipped if he had not favored Joseph so highly, to the point where his other brothers became deeply envious. And then um, Rebecca was never able to see her favorite son again. So, she was the one who was pushing Jacob towards deceiving their father Isaac, and she never got to see her favorite son, never got to see the grandchildren there. So a little bit of a bit of a punishment for their duplicity. Um, And then I think probably a good point to think about not only Jacob and not only Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but anybody who's has wrongdoings or sins recorded in the Bible anywhere, is that God uses these sins for His own design. So, you know, Joseph being sold into slavery in Egypt was an indirect result of Jacob favoring one son over the others, which isn't certainly not good behavior. It might even rise to the level of a sin. Um, but if Joseph hadn't gone to Egypt ahead of time and hadn't been placed in the position he was, then the land of Egypt wouldn't have had time to prepare for the famine that Joseph prophesied, and then Jacob and his family would have likely starved during that famine. But because of all of these things, certainly Jacob's sins and then the sins of his brothers, selling their own brother into slavery and lying to their father about his supposed death, um, if those things had not happened, then that good wouldn't have happened. So God was able to use these sins even for his own designs.
Yeah, he worked the failure of man into his plan. It wasn't the perfect plan, or it was the perfect plan, right? Because God made it. It wasn't the perfect way these things could have worked out, but God made it work.
Right, right. Yeah, God is able to maneuver around our sins, which is great news. I'm
Yep, he plans for the best and expects the worst.
yeah, yep, yeah. So anyway, that wraps up our discussion on the book of Genesis. If there's anything that you want to hear about, you can go ahead and ask that in the comment section. But that's all I brought forward. And I think we're going to end here the entire program in the book of Exodus, talking about the book, not the band. Continuing um, almost a continuous narrative from the end of the book of Genesis. Book of Genesis ends with the 12 tribes of Israel being established in Egypt, and then the book of Exodus begins with them being reduced to slavery. Now, again, we're going to talk about the historicity of the book of Exodus. Some people who deny the historicity of the Exodus from Egypt and the existence of Moses, they say that there's no ancient non-biblical sources confirming it as history. Again, with the whole miracles thing, it's a folklore because it has miracles. That there was no archaeological evidence present, and that nobody's been able to set widely agreed or universally agreed upon date for when this would have happened. But there are plenty of good arguments for the Book of Exodus. The story told there being founded firmly in history. Um, so
Well, Eric, don't we have archaeological evidence of at least Jewish slavery in Egypt?
we'll get there.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So
Sorry, I didn't look ahead.
yeah, ancient non-biblical sources. Why aren't there any of those? Well, uh, one of the most well-documented civilizations we have is the Egyptian civilization, and as we mentioned earlier, the official chronicles state quite clearly that no pharaoh has ever lost a battle or made a mistake ever, just like the Communist Party in China. Moreover, we have secondary accounts from Egyptian historian named Manetho, 4th century BC, who was certainly no fan of the Jews of his time, but he grudgingly admitted the history of the Exodus account and just explained why it wasn't really that important. We don't have his writings. We have them through another historian named Josephus, but he referenced this historian. Moreover, when we talk about folk tales, we usually start those with "Once upon a time in a land far away." Exodus is not like that at all. We've got specific names of places. We've got specific geographical features. They're giving uh, uh, dates after the time of Abraham, which are not commonly part of folklore. And then again with the whole miracles thing, I think people just need to get over that. And as for the archaeological evidence, I just want to ask, how much of the Sinai Desert have you personally dug up, looking for looking for people living in tents, wandering around there for 40 years? Like, are you expecting to find the tents? Because I don't think deserts are too kind to, 20, 3,000-year-old cloth. Moreover, the historical context makes a lot of sense. Um, there were Semitic slaves common in Egypt at this time. Um, there were records of slaves escaping, and the military trying to stop them. The 10 plagues seem to follow the Egyptian agricultural calendar. So when this plague would have happened, at what point during the season, planting or what. The specific detail of bricks made with straw, um, all the bricks we can find from this period do in fact have traces of straw in them. And there's even more evidence that the historical context of this story is uh, it fits well with the time that this story would have been. So again, we have these biblical scholars who are making arguments that it's not historical, and they don't have the definitive word on it because there's plenty of good evidence that it is historical, maybe even a preponderance of evidence that it is historical. Um, let's just get over the miracles thing. Like, maybe they actually happen.
Yeah.
So anyway, I don't think we need to belabor that point too much. Now, there's an interesting question. When exactly did the Exodus occur? So there's two major camps among biblical scholars. First is it happened sometime in the 1450s BC. That would line up very well with the date given in the first book of Kings, talking about the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt. Um, King Solomon built the temple. He began building the temple of God in Jerusalem. So the dating works out because we got a pretty good sense of when David and Solomon would have lived. And moreover, we have these copies of correspondence between the Pharaoh and kings in Canaan that were happening in the 1300s BC. Um, they were talking about this landless people called the Epiru who were attacking and destroying their cities, um, which would be, that's what the Israelites had to do when they got to the promised land, is they had to fight for it. So you remember Joshua, the big wall at Jericho, other battles he fought. Um, so it's like, well, there are these Apiru people, which kind of sounds a little bit like Hebrew. Uh, is that what these letters are referring to? And we can't know for certain because there's also evidence for placing the date of the Exodus in the 1200 BCs. Um, so that date is actually supported by the majority of scholars, and it would have occurred during the reign of Ramesses II, circa 1303 BC to 1213 BC. So they talk about how the Israelites were forced to build the store cities of Pithom and Ramesses for Pharaoh, and we know that Ramesses II made the city named after him the capital city. I guess dictators are pretty fond of naming cities after themselves, Stalingrad and all that. Um, Moreover, Ramesses was very, very much into using slave labor from the Canaanite peoples, the Semitic peoples, for his building projects. So that actually fits the profile of the king who forgot Joseph and forced them into slavery. That fits the profile really well. Ramesses' successor, I'm going to try Meneptah. Meneptah, yeah, that's how it's spelled.
It's
Left behind.
anybody's guess here.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, he actually left behind a record that listed his successes in battle, listing among them Israel. So this is actually the oldest written account we have of the existence of the people of Israel. And the grammar and context used in this passage that he's writing make it clear that Israel is an ethnic group without a land, which would fit well into the Joshua narrative. So, um, and there also is some archaeological evidence for destroyed cities at this time, but archaeology, when you get back this far, is really hard. It's really hard to date things properly, and there's a lot of arguments. So you don't want to put too much stock in what archaeologists say because when you've got three archaeologists in a room, you can probably find four different opinions on the same topic. So at the end of the day, it's either of these dates seem like they could be fairly probable to me. You might worry about the author of the first book of Kings getting the date wrong. If you pick the 1200 date, then he has not enough time between Moses and Solomon and David. We got to remember that First Kings would have been written after the exile, right? So after 587 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar sacked Jerusalem and exiled much of the population to Babylon. Um, and so that would have been when it was written. It would have had to been after that event. And, like maybe the historian at that time uh, didn't have records. He just had some oral traditions. Nobody was keeping exact dates from the time of Moses to the time of David and Solomon. Um, and so maybe he just got the date wrong, and that shouldn't throw our biblical faith off.
Yeah, I mean, it's authored by God through written by humans,
Right.
and honestly, dates don't really matter that much. But this is what I love about being Catholic is we do take these things seriously. We
Hmm.
do sit and we study scriptural texts from a rational level, like we would any historical text, but then through the lens of faith,
Hmm.
or ancient text, I should say,
Hmm.
and then through the lens of faith. Uh,
Hmm.
but dates aren't a huge deal. You
Yeah.
can subscribe to a school if you'd like, but it doesn't matter for your salvation.
Right. Right. Yeah. You don't have to know exactly when Moses lived. You can still go to
Yeah.
heaven. That's great news. Um, I've just got a few slides left. I think we're going to keep on going, even though it is 7:30. Unless there's a mountain of questions in the queue.
No,
So
you can keep going.
yeah, that's what I thought. So let's talk about these plagues, right? 10 plagues against the people of Egypt. So you could think, wow, boy, that's a lot. Seems a little excessive. First off, one thing you have to understand is at this time, it was commonly assumed and held that the king of a people uh, had in his person the entire people, right? So Pharaoh was basically the personification of the whole land of Egypt, and therefore his sins would be felt across the entire land. And moreover, every one of these plagues corresponds with an Egyptian god. So, Happy, the god of the Nile, well, the Nile gets turned into blood. Uh, Heket, the frog goddess of fertility, frog goddess, that's a great. Um, so she was just depicted as a frog, and all of a sudden, these frogs, who she should be in control of, are swarming the place. Gnats and flies, we've got Kefir, the beetle god, and a symbol of the sun, and Utachit, the fly god. Well, all of a sudden they're not in control of their flies anymore.
What is the four in front of Kiffer?
So those two are kind of mixed up in the same two plagues. So three and four. You notice I skipped four and go to five.
Oh, I see. Yep.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. We've got the death of livestock. That's the fifth plague, and we've got Apis, the bull god, and Hathor, the cow goddess. Cow goddess. Boils and sores, that's the sixth plague. We've got Sekhmet, the goddess of healing. Hail during a harvest. We don't have to explain to the people of Langdon why that's bad. Um, we've got Nut, the sky goddess, Shu, the air god, and Tefnut, the rain goddess, all of them dropping the ball. Locusts coming in, that's on Senechem's plate. 3 days of darkness. Then we're getting to the major league gods here. Amon-Ra, the sun god, he should be able to prevent 3 days of darkness. And then finally, we've got the death of the firstborn of Egypt. That's going directly at Pharaoh. Not even Pharaoh's son was spared. And Pharaoh at this time was considered a god. And Osiris, the main major Egyptian god, the god of life and the god of Pharaoh, the patron of Pharaoh, obviously unable to stop Yahweh, unable to stop El Shaddai, Elohim, whatever names you want to give them. They're all referred to the same top god. So hopefully that kind of context can make those stories seem a little less harsh. And we've got
Deacon
some,
Eric,
yeah.
Deacon Eric, do you think this is something that when this was happening in real time, do you think this is something the Egyptians were thinking about?
Right. Well, that was a common, it was certainly acted out in their religious. So let's talk about Pharaoh as the personification of Egypt. Their religious ceremonies would have included uh, Pharaoh. If they had a bad year, Pharaoh repenting for not being a good Pharaoh that year, and if they had a good year, praise for Pharaoh in his person. Um, and certainly, ancient peoples, ancient polytheists, they had gods coming out of every doorknob and um, you know inch of square land. They lived in a world flooded with gods, and when things happened, it was because of the gods. It wasn't because of natural processes. So I don't see how all of a sudden all these bad things happen. Um, People with that mindset wouldn't see the gods behind every single part of it.
Yeah, and then here comes a guy claiming a new god, one that's foreign to them,
Hmm.
and just kind of overrides theirs, the
Right.
ones they've been praying to.
And everything he says is going to happen happens.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. Good question. Happy to answer it. All right, so let's talk about Pharaoh's hardness of heart, and it was kind of a shock the first time I read this in the Bible. It literally says the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. So there's like, did God all of a sudden not let Pharaoh have free will, and would have even been possible for Pharaoh to have relented, to have given up, to have let them go earlier than he did? Um, Well, we have another passage that says quite clearly, when Pharaoh saw that rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he relapsed into sin, and he and his officials became obstinate again. Pharaoh was stubborn, and as Yahweh had foretold through Moses, refused to let the Israelites go. So it's very interesting that they would use the word sin there. Um, and throughout the whole tradition, we've always believed that a sin committed by an individual is always involves free will. So you could have chosen not to sin. And then in several other places, it also says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. So it puts it into kind of a passive voice. So we have the Lord hardening Pharaoh's heart. We've got Pharaoh hardening his heart. And then we have something else. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And the way we can interpret this is that uh, these phrasings are present to handle the providence of God and authentic human freedom. So Pharaoh's stubbornness doesn't derail God's plan. In fact, God's plan prepared for his stubbornness ahead of time and worked that into the plan for maximum effect. Um, and so that's why it would say the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Um, Also, this didn't override Pharaoh's free will. He could have theoretically chosen to relent. He still had that capacity. However, repeatedly he chose stubbornness and stubbornness and stubbornness. And so that's why we've got this middle passage where it talks about Pharaoh hardening his own heart. And then, thirdly, why do we have this phrasing where Pharaoh's heart was hardened? We have that in the passive voice, so we don't know what was doing the hardening. And the thing about sin is it's always more mysterious than good. and it's always more irrational than good. So if you can really have somebody who's repenting, they can look back at the sin they did and say, no, I knew exactly what I should have been doing, and I didn't do that, and this has actually worked out worse for me overall. So it's always the virtuous behavior that's clear and rational. So many commentators suggest having this passive phrasing in there um, is to show the mystery, this mysterious force that's driving Pharaoh to sin rather than be good.
Well, I mean, that mysterious force is himself. You look at any of us in our lives of sin, we keep doing it, and we know that it's bad. And if you and we all know people that have entrenched themselves so much into it
Hmm.
that they rationalize it. They say this is a good,
Hmm. Hmm.
and
And
I'm doing what's right. And we can look at it through Christian eyes and say, no, you're not, but you don't see it.
yeah, I don't know about you, Riley, but a lot of my confessions have the exact same content.
You broke up a lot of your what?
A lot of my confessions have the exact same content every time.
Oh, my goodness,
Yeah,
yes.
and it's like,
Um,
I've been educated in theology. I know that's wrong. Oh, well, still doing it. So,
yeah, and we always choose it. No one's forcing us into doing
mhm.
these bad things, but sometimes sin just becomes so entrenched we don't know. It's like trying to uproot an oak tree.
Yeah, yeah, you're gonna need some thermite to get it up.
Yep. But you and I and good Christians can at least say, I knew that was wrong and I did it anyway, and I
Hmm.
screwed up.
Hmm.
But you look at someone like Pharaoh that's so deep in this, he thinks he's doing what's right.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, he could
Yeah.
be fully aware that these are selfish choices, but he thinks that it's okay.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Sin, always a mystery. This is the last slide I've made, and we're getting to do it in decent time. Very interesting. So the Greek translation of the Old Testament, called the Septuagint, that has said the Red Sea, and um, so we're talking about Moses crossing the Red Sea. That's what everybody says, and it's a traditional interpretation. However, if you go back to the original Hebrew text, it says Sea of Reeds. Um, so that's very interesting. That kind of cuts against the grain of what we've been raised with. Um, and a lot of people think this is one of several marshy lakes between Egypt and Sinai. So not amazingly deep, but very wide lakes, and would have had considerable flora around the edges of it. Um, and so some people have gone so far as to say that God didn't actually perform a miracle here, um, that they just managed to cross this while the tide was out, and then the tide came in on on Pharaoh and his chariots and his charioteers. But however, you don't have to really be that in that deep of water to have a miraculous wall of water on each side for the Israelites to pass through. It's like if you're in 5 feet of water, like seeing that split and then being able to walk across dry ground, not muddy ground. Uh, I think under ordinary circumstances that would certainly be considered a miracle, and it could still be deep enough to drown the Egyptians. Maybe a little deeper, maybe need 6 feet or something. I don't know. Um, but if they can't swim, then they're kind of done. And
Yeah,
then the biblical text explicitly says that the mud began to clog their wheels as they were going through. So while the Israelites were walking across it, they had nice firm ground, and then it became muddy after after the Israelites went past, and it clogged up the chariots. So I I like read that for the first time recently. I was like, huh, never heard that one. So either way
I
you
mean,
go with the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds, it could still be the story you remember. It just won't be, the whole Sea of Reeds thing isn't going to be quite as epic as Charlton Heston, splitting um, 30 feet of water. Uh,
No, it's not as dramatic.
Yeah, so Hollywood has my permission to continue using the Red Sea instead of the Sea of Reeds. Please do. Highly encouraged.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there you go.
that's it.
So now
That's,
does everybody know how to read the Bible?
I hope so.
No, there's a lot to it. I hope that at least these past few weeks, Deacon Eric and I have gave you a good basis of how to interpret, at least in the beginning level, how to read it.
Right,
And
and
keeping in mind, Eric and I are still learning as well.
right. You never stop learning. Just want to have you on a solid foundation so you don't get surprised or shocked or disturbed by something you read in the Bible. You'll have ways to think about it that'll keep you uh, close to God, hopefully.
Yeah, the inexhaustible depths of Scripture.
Yeah. Yep.
And I hope you learned a thing or two as well.
Me? Oh, I learned a lot researching
Yeah,
this.
good. I did too, just listening to you.
Hmm.
The fruit of your research.
Yeah. Yep. Riley's the fruit of my research.
Behold.
Well, I think we're just going to go ahead and call it. So say goodbye to the world, Riley.
Goodbye, world. We'll see you in the summer, maybe.
Yeah. Bye, world.